Okay, so today we're gonna dive into something pretty cool, I think.
Yeah.
It's a comparative analysis, and the title is really straightforward. It's ChatGPT versus DeepSeek AI: a comparative analysis.
Catchy.
Yeah, so we're gonna unpack that a bit today, and basically the big question that they're trying to answer in this paper is which of these AI models reigns supreme?
Yeah, it's a head to head.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because, there's been a lot of buzz, obviously, about both of these AI models. And
Right.
I think this analysis does a nice job of actually putting them side by side and,
Yeah.
kind of looking at their strengths and weaknesses and really trying to tease out, where one might be better than the other or vice versa.
Yeah, I think what's interesting too is just the fact that we are at a point where this kind of comparison is even possible. Even
Right.
a few years ago, this would have been, a very theoretical discussion. And now we have these tools that are out there that people are using, and it's like, okay, let's actually see, how they stack up against each other.
Yeah, it is a little bit provocative, though, right? I mean, when you
Yeah.
say which reigns supreme,
Sure.
that kind of sets up this expectation that there's going to be a winner.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it definitely frames it as a competition, but I think what's going to be more interesting for us and for the listener is really getting into, the specifics of where each model excels, because I don't think there's going to be like a clear-cut winner. It's going to be more nuanced than that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it probably depends a lot on what you're actually trying to use the model for.
Exactly.
So speaking of that, what are some of the key things that we should be looking for in this analysis? Like, what aspects of the models did they really focus on to differentiate them?
Well, so they'll probably look at the underlying architecture of each model, how they're built, um, the training data that they were trained on, because that obviously has a huge impact on their capabilities, and probably some kind of performance benchmarks, how well do they actually perform on different tasks?
I would imagine that the training data is like a huge factor in how these models differ.
No, absolutely. I mean, the amount of data that these models are trained on is just astronomical, and the type of data really influences, what they're good at. So if one model was trained on, a lot of code, for example, it might be really good at generating code.
Right.
Whereas another model might be trained on, more creative writing, and so it might be better at, writing stories or poems.
Yeah, and I think for our listener who may not be like super deep in the weeds on I think it's important to understand that, these models aren't just like magic black boxes. There are these very concrete differences in how they're built and how they're trained that really impact how they work.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just like you type something in and it magically spits out an answer. There's a lot of complexity under the hood.
Right. And that complexity is actually what makes them so interesting and so powerful
Hmm.
because, depending on how they're built, they can be used for all sorts of different things.
Yeah, and I think if we connect this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
this comparison isn't just an academic exercise.
Yeah.
This actually has real world implications.
Sure.
If you're a business and you're trying to decide which AI model to integrate into your workflow, well, understanding these nuances could really impact, which model you choose and how successful that integration is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can imagine like a content creator, they might be more interested in a model that's really good at generating creative text,
Right.
whereas a programmer might be more interested in a model that can, help them write code or debug code.
Exactly. So the idea of, one model being supreme, I think starts to break down a little bit when you think about it in terms of specific use cases.
Right. It's more about finding the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
So I think as we go through this analysis, we should keep in mind that, the answer to this question of which reigns supreme might not be a simple A or B.
Yeah.
It's going to be more complex than that.
I agree. And I think the analysis is going to be a good guide for us.
Hmm.
It's going to point out these key areas where the models differ. And then our job is to kind of unpack that for the listener and help them understand, what those differences mean in practice.
Yeah, for sure. And I think for our listener, as you're listening to this, think about, what supreme would even mean for you. Like, what are the criteria that you would use to evaluate these models?
Yeah, good point.
Because ultimately it's about, what's going to be most useful for you in your own work or your own interests.
Absolutely. And I think having that kind of personalized lens is going to make this conversation a lot more relevant.
Yeah, I think so too. All right, so let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So right off the bat, the analysis starts by talking about the underlying architecture of these two models. And I think this is a good place to start because it really lays the foundation for understanding how they work.
Yeah, definitely, because the architecture kind of dictates what the model is capable of. It's the blueprint.
Exactly. So ChatGPT is built on something called a transformer architecture,
Okay.
which is a type of neural network that's become really popular in natural language processing in recent years.
Right, transformers, they're all the rage.
They are, and for good reason. They're really good at processing sequential data like text, so they can take in a sequence of words and understand the relationships between those words, and then use that understanding to generate new text or translate languages or all sorts of other things.
So it's like they're able to see the bigger picture, not just individual words in isolation.
Exactly. They can see the context, which is really important for language.
Right.
Now, DeepSeek AI, on the other hand, is built on a slightly different architecture. It's called a generative adversarial network, or GAN for short.
Okay, GANs. Have heard of those.
Yeah, so GANs are interesting because they actually involve two neural networks that kind of work against each other.
Oh, that's interesting.
So you have one network called the generator that tries to create new data, and then you have another network called the discriminator that tries to distinguish between real data and the fake data that the generator is creating.
So it's like a constant back and forth. They're trying to outsmart each other.
Exactly. And through this process of competition, the generator gets better and better at creating realistic data.
So in the context of AI, like ChatGPT and DeepSeek, how does that actually play out?
So in the context of something like DeepSeek AI, the generator network would be responsible for generating text, and the discriminator network would be responsible for evaluating that text and saying, does this sound like it was written by a human, or does this sound like it was generated by a machine?
Okay, so it's using that adversarial process to refine the quality of the output.
Exactly. And this approach has been really successful in generating things like images and videos, and it's now being applied to text as well.
So that's really interesting because right away we're seeing a fundamental difference in how these two models are approaching the task of generating text.
Right. And this difference in architecture is likely going to have implications for how they perform on different tasks.
Yeah, and imagine, so for example, transformers like ChatGPT, they're known for being really good at tasks that require a deep understanding of language, like translation or summarization.
Right.
Whereas gens like DeepSeek AI, they might be better at tasks that are more creative or open-ended, like generating different kinds of creative text formats or even like musical melodies.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think the takeaway here is that the architecture is really important. It kind of sets the stage for what the model is good at and how it approaches problems.
Definitely. And it's just the first layer. We're going to get into some other interesting comparisons as we go through this analysis.
All right, so moving on to the next point.
Yeah.
The analysis talks about the training data that each model was trained on. And as we mentioned earlier, this is a huge factor in determining how they perform.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can think of the training data as like the food that the model consumes. It's what it learns from.
Right. So ChatGPT was trained on a massive data set of text and code that was scraped from the internet.
Okay, so like a really broad range of information.
Yeah, I mean, it's like billions and billions of words, everything from books and articles to websites and social media posts.
Wow, so it's got this like vast knowledge base to draw from.
Exactly. And this is one of the reasons why ChatGPT is so good at generating different kinds of text, because it's been exposed to so many different writing styles and genres.
Makes sense. So what about DeepSeek AI? What was it trained on?
So DeepSeek AI was also trained on a large data set of text, but the analysis suggests that the data was curated more carefully.
Okay, so not just like a random grab bag from the internet.
Right. It seems like they focused on higher quality sources like books and academic papers.
So potentially a more focused and refined knowledge base.
Exactly. And this might be why DeepSeek AI is particularly good at tasks that require a deeper understanding of language, like question answering or reasoning.
Yeah, because it's been trained on data that's more likely to contain factual information and logical arguments.
Right. So again, we're seeing how the training data can really influence the strengths and weaknesses of each model.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder that, these models are only as good as the data they're trained on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking about using one of these models for a specific task, it's worth considering what kind of data it was trained on and whether that aligns with your needs.
Definitely. And I think as AI continues to develop, we're going to see even more specialization in terms of training data.
Yeah, I think so too. So you might have models that are specifically trained for things like legal documents or medical records or, really any kind of specialized domain.
And that's exciting because it means that these models are going to become even more powerful and useful in the future.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so the last thing I wanted to touch on is the performance benchmarks that the analysis look at.
Okay, so this is where we get to see how the models actually perform head to head.
Exactly. So the analysis compared ChatGPT and DeepSeek AI on a variety of different tasks, including things like text generation, translation, summarization, question answering, and code generation.
Wow. So a pretty comprehensive evaluation.
Yeah, they really tried to cover a lot of ground, and the results were interesting.
Okay, I'm curious to hear what they found.
So, in some cases, ChatGPT performed better. In other cases, DeepSeek AI performed better. And in some cases, they were pretty much neck and neck.
So there wasn't like a clear winner across the board,
Right. It really depended on the specific task.
which I think reinforces what we were talking about earlier. It really depends on what you're trying to do with the model.
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, ChatGPT was consistently better at generating different kinds of creative text formats like poems and scripts,
Okay, so it excelled in those more imaginative tasks.
right? Whereas DeepSeek AI was better at tasks that required more factual accuracy and logical reasoning, like question answering and code
Hmm.
generation.
So it sounds like each model has its own distinct strengths.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the analysis does a good job of highlighting those strengths.
So for someone who's listening to this, what's the key takeaway here?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that there is no one-size-fits-all AI model.
Hmm.
There are different tools for different jobs.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each tool before you decide which one to use.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's also a good reminder that this field is constantly evolving.
All right.
New models are being developed all the time. So what might be the best model today might be surpassed by something even better tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important to stay informed and to keep up with the latest developments.
Definitely. And I think this analysis is a good starting point. It gives us a snapshot of where things stand right now.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it also raises some interesting questions about the future of AI.
Yeah.
As these models become more and more powerful, what are the implications for society as a whole?
Yeah. That's a big question and one that we're going to have to grapple with as a society.
Absolutely. All right. Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive.
Sounds good.
So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.
But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought. We've been talking about these AI models as tools, and I think that's a helpful way to think about them. But it's also worth remembering that they're incredibly powerful tools, and they have the potential to be used for both good and bad.
Yeah, that's true.
So as we continue to develop these technologies, I think it's important to have a conversation about how we can ensure that they're used responsibly and ethically.
Yeah, I agree. It's not just about the technology itself. It's about how we choose to use it.
Exactly. So that's something to think about. All right, that's all for today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.